man. I'll tell you what, that dang old internet, man. You just go on there and point and click, get in there, talk about www. Call me, you got that.
For some reason or another, you sound a little taller on radio.
Well, for my money, he's got all the facial characteristics of a criminal.
Now, here's your host, that gravy sopping, crappie flopping, stump jumping, Bible thumping, gun toting, mater growing son of a gun, the Backwoods Baptist himself, Pastor Harold Smith.
Yes, welcome back. Welcome back to the Backwoods Baptist podcast. We're going to do something totally different today, something that I've never really done on this podcast, and I've been doing a lot of driving. You know, my focus is to try to find a church that needs some help, needs some pastoral help to get back on track, serve as an interim pastor, and then help them find somebody to carry on the work, and then go find another church like that. Right now, I'm in between, so I'm not. I finished up at Roland in June, and I never know how long it's going to take in between, and the Lord has filled up these weeks in between finishing at Roland and now with opportunities to preach every Sunday but one. There was one Sunday I did not preach between, what is this, the first week of December? Yeah. Yep. Last week of June, first week of December, and I'll be preaching Revival next week in Heber Springs with Clint Vernon. So right now, the reason I say all that is I've been doing a lot of driving. And for a month, I preached in Bryant, Arkansas for Greg Coleman at Grace Baptist. And Greg took every Sunday off, kind of had a little sabbatical. And
well, I'm going to have to talk to him.
Yeah. Well,
he invited me out there. He told me he wanted me to come. And
I would do it for you if you want to take a month off. I don't know if you'll have a church left when you get back. But anyways, so I would be there for Sunday school, even though I didn't teach Sunday school. I would, you know, if they have Sunday school, I want to be in Sunday school. Yeah. I want to set the example for the church. You know, if the church is meeting, you ought to be there. So Sunday school starts at 9:00 in Bryant, Arkansas. I live near the Oklahoma state line outside of Fort Smith, you know. So we drive 2.5 hours every Sunday morning. So I'm on the road by 6:30, you know.
Wow.
And you can only listen to, I hate to say this, it may sound sacrilegious. You can only listen to so much Leonard Skinner and the Allman Brothers and the Marshall Tucker Band, and you're like, all right, I need something different. So I started listening to podcasts, which I've been listening to podcasts off and on for a while. But I mainly did that when I walked, you know. My wife, since we're leaving early, she falls right back asleep. You know, we'll get in the car.
Oh, yeah, I got one of them.
Yeah, so as soon as we cross the cattle guard, she goes out, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm like, well, if she's going to sleep, because she don't like to listen to podcasts most of the time. So anyways, I started listening to podcasts. Well, if you're 2.5 hours down there, spill my coffee, 2.5 hours down there and 2.5 hours back, you got 5 hours of podcast every Sunday. And then I preached a few other meetings last month. I preached in Conway. I preached in Bloomer for Michael Sanchez. I preached in Dayton a couple nights for Brian Stover. Well, I used up all my good 30-minute podcasts. You know, they're gone. I went through 3 or 4 months of them. And so I found myself listening to Joe Rogan. And I'm not a big Joe Rogan fan. I mean, you know, he doesn't believe in God. You know, no. He mocks Christians a lot. I really don't like Joe Rogan. And he's a great commentator for the UFC. I've followed the UFC about as long as he's been involved with it. But my point being, Joe Rogan's podcast sometimes lasts for 3 or 4 hours.
Yep.
And I was listening to him talk the other day, and, you know, he said, my whole premise is just to get people on here and talk. Donald Trump was on there for like 3 hours.
Oh, yeah.
Is it Kamala or Kamala or who?
I don't want to.
Vice President Harris. Yeah, I don't want to say her name wrong. I don't want to offend any of the Democrats that listen.
Well, I don't want to offend that old wrestler Kamala. You know, it's not right to him, man.
Yeah. He doesn't deserve that kind of treatment.
That's right.
He's been in the ring for years. So, anyways, she didn't want to go on there because she couldn't just talk for 3 hours. You know, she has her teleprompter and her
That would have been the most watched episode, though.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So then he has he has J.D. Vance on there, and it's the same way. It's just, and I found myself just like, I think we were driving back. I'd preached in Georgia. We were driving back from Georgia, and I was listening to Donald Trump on Joe Rogan. And, you know, I voted for Trump 3 times, but I found myself kind of enjoying the conversation, you know, and Joe's like, look, I don't care who it is. I don't care what we talk about. People tune in to me to hear 2 people talk. And I said, you know, I want to do that every once in a while on the podcast.
Yeah.
So that's what we're going to do today. It's just Ronnie and I are going to talk. So if you want to know what the agenda is, it's nothing. We threw away our note card at the end of the.
This is like Seinfeld. This is a podcast about nothing.
Yeah, it's a podcast about nothing. So it's just Ron. Well, so we just went and ate lunch, and we sat in complete silence at lunch and didn't talk to each other.
Yeah, if you can believe that.
Yeah. So Ronnie and I, when we get together, we just start talking, and we have a good time. When he calls me or I call him, it's never a 10-minute conversation.
Even if we say it's going to be.
Hey, I know you're busy. I just want to run something past you real quick. And it's like that guy off SpongeBob, 4 hours later, you know? So that's what we're going to do. We're just going to talk. We're just going to let the conversation go wherever it wants to go.
You know, this is the stuff right here that, you know, when you tune in to pastors or something, you know, you're getting the pastory type feel. But there's always that part when you just like to talk to them behind the scenes and just kind of get to know them. So that's really, you know, I mean, it's like you can like me, you can not like me either way.
Well, the only thing
is
who
I am. So
we can't talk about other people because it is being recorded.
Yep, that's true.
So
not that I would do that. Harold might, but I'm not going to do that. So
I've been told that you gossip about me.
I probably have. It's all good though.
When someone says, you won't believe what he said about you, I said, oh, I've been called worse by better than that.
Yep, that is true, man.
So we're at the bookstore, and people are window shopping in the bookstore wondering why the door's locked and they can't come in.
Well.
But, no, you know, when we were eating lunch and we were just talking about different things and just ministry in general, all of the aspects of ministry that we as pastors deal with, there's things that pastors really can't talk to the church about because the church doesn't understand what a pastor does.
Yeah.
And so that's why I've kind of made it my one of the most important things of what I do is getting pastors together so pastors can talk. When I first When I went into the ministry, I was just used to, you know, I tried to meet everybody else that did a job like mine, you know, so I could, hey, what are you doing? How are you doing it? And people started saying, well, Harold, you're the only friend I have. And I'm like, you don't have any other friends? And they're like, well, I've got friends. I got acquaintances. But you're the only friend I got. And so I was the only shoulder anybody had to cry on. I was the only shoulder anybody had to brag to. I was the only shoulder several of these guys had, you know, to bounce something off of. And so I said, you know, I really ought to introduce all my friends, and then they can call each other and leave me alone. I'll go fishing one day a week. That was my motivation for trying to get preachers together.
Yeah.
And here I am 17 years later, and we have a lunch every month for preachers to get together and talk. And it sounds like a hen house when you walk back behind the office here, and there's 15 or 20 preachers back there on the couches just cackling away.
Yeah, and it's really good. You know, it's like Michael Sanchez, you know, he was telling me that I guess when he had a little conference, it was early this year, right? Or was it last year? Yeah.
No, it was this year.
Yeah, and so he invited me to come preach at it. Well, he tells his congregation that there's a former cult leader coming to preach, which is me. And it's not that glamorous, but he has a lady in his church. I guess she still asked him like, "Hey, is that cult leader gonna come back?"
She came and asked me. Remember
is that what it was?
We were sitting there. It was lunch. They were serving lunch, I won't mention the lady's name, but she knows me pretty well. I've preached at Michael's. I helped Michael, I helped the church
Right.
find Michael,
Right.
help Michael get into Bloomer Baptist there. So the church knows me pretty well. I've preached there quite a bit over the years. And she comes up to me and she goes, Michael told us there's going to be a cult leader preaching here. I said, yeah, this guy right here. And she goes, she looked over there at you. Remember? She looked over at you and she's kind of bug-eyed. She didn't know what to say. And I introduced her. I said, Ronnie, this was the lady that pastored here before Michael came. And that just really flustered her because I said she was the former pastor, which she was not.
Yeah.
Not even a pastor's wife. But I always, would just like to kid people like that. And, yeah, then she was flustered and too embarrassed to say anything to you.
Well, now, just so you'll know that Sanchez, he was probably just paying me back because my sister lived up in around Springdale and all that for a while, and she's kind of looking for a church. Now, I'm geographically dysfunctional, so I had no idea I didn't know where Bloomer was at the time.
I think she came to church there when I preached there for some reason or another.
I think she did, and but I told her, she said, well, what's this guy like? And I said, well, his name's Michael Sanchez, but don't be expecting a Mexican-looking fella, I said, picture little Abner if he was a preacher, because Michael, man, he's a big guy, this big old beard, and
it's like 6'5" with a beard hitting him in the bottom of the chest.
Yeah, and I don't know what it is, but I always think of dog patch. But the funny thing about Michael is he's a highly intelligent, educated guy, and loves to study and read and all that. But yeah, and just so Michael will know, man, I'm very thankful for the guy, but the thing that you're talking about, getting friends together, and guys telling you, it's like you're my only friend. There's a sense of where guys, pastors can open up, and I think what you have a lot of times is there's some people that are just too afraid to do that, and therefore they just don't have really any close friends or anything, and there's a part of Christianity that's vulnerable, and you're opening yourself up to other people, and and hey, it may not go well for you, but I just throw caution to the wind, myself.
When we have these pastor luncheons, people say, well, what do y'all talk about? And I'll say, I have no idea until we get there. And they're like, so you just I said, they talk about whatever they want to talk about.
I don't even know if I should bring up that one deal.
We've talked.
Oh, my gosh, it was the funniest thing.
What was it?
Well, let's see. It had to do with raccoons.
Oh, yes.
The Indian whistle.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That was on me.
Oh, my goodness.
So, man, when you talk about just doing a long format podcast, talking about whatever you want to talk about. So, yeah, last time we were talking about male raccoons have an extra bone in their anatomy, an actual calcified bone in their anatomy, and coon hunters collect them. Moonshiners put them in the worm where the alcohol condenses back, and it causes the alcohol to come out of the little tube instead of just like spurting out. It causes it to drop straight down in the moonshine jar. And so and as a kid, I had several of them because I trapped and skinned raccoons, and we would collect these like trophies. It's like you'd cut the horns off a deer, you'd clean them up. And so I was messing with one in home economics class my senior year, poking people with it, and they knew what it was. And the teacher saw what all was going on, and she's like, bring that up here. So I brought it up there, and she had no idea what it was, And she said, what is this? I said, it's an Indian whistle. You better not take another drink, Ronnie.
I know, that's bad timing.
I said, it's an Indian whistle. And she said, an Indian whistle? And so, yeah, so she starts trying to blow the Indian whistle. And literally everybody in the class knows exactly what that is and that it's not an Indian whistle. Everybody but her.
She tried hard, though,
She
right?
tried hard. She tried for 30 seconds. And she looked at me, and I said, well, some people can blow them, some people can't. And
dude, I laughed about that all the way home. I just kept running that through my head. This woman
Oh,
trying to blow the Indian whistle.
And then for days, I was nervous that somebody was going to go to her and say, "Hey,
oh man,
do you know what that really was that he had handed you?" Because then I thought, man, if she ever finds out,
hey, you don't think she listens to this podcast, do you?
No. Well, she wouldn't tune in. She'd be like, she'd see it. She'd be like, "Oh, it's different Harold Smith. No way the kid I had in school is preaching and doing a podcast."
Yeah, I've heard that one a few times about me. I don't remember what reunion it was, but class reunion is 20th or something. When I was living in Montana, and I didn't get to go, but the word got back to me that they would say, "Hey, what's Ronnie doing?" And they say, "Oh, he's preaching." And everybody like, "What did you say?" Thinking it was a joke, you know. Yeah, so I
was
wasn't
struggling with the call to preach. I mean, I really felt called to preach, and I didn't want to. It was the last thing in the world I wanted to do. But I was to the point where I felt like this is what I have to do. And so my Sunday school teacher, well, he wasn't my Sunday school teacher. We were co-teaching a class. They wanted me to teach a Sunday school class, and I didn't want to do it. So they made me a co-teacher and started a new class. And then the other guy would just show up and go, "Hey, I'm not prepared, man. Can you take over?" And that was like a lot, you know. And so anyways, I told him, I said, "Hey, don't tell nobody. I think I'm called to preach," you know. First thing he did is he went and told the pastor, "Hey, Harold's called to preach." And I believe he is called to preach. And so, you know, word gets out, "Hey, he's called to preach." And so anyways, the interim pastor, we had just called a pastor. He wasn't there yet. And the interim pastor called me to his house. They tricked me into going over there. I didn't know where we were going. We show up. I'm like, "Why are we here?"
Yeah.
And he goes, "Well, I told him he was called to preach." And he's like, "What?" I was like, "Well, what?" And so I'm in there telling this guy. So anyways, long story short, he says, "Tell the pastor when he gets here that you're called to preach, and then whatever he tells you to do, that's what you do." So the pastor came, and I mean, our church was a good size church. We were around about 450 people.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 2 services on Sunday morning, and run about 450, 500 people at the time. And so I told the pastor, I said, "Hey, I'm called to preach." And he's like, "Oh, great. You preach this Sunday night." I was like, "This Sunday night?" "Yeah." So I called my parents up, you know, mom and dad, and I'm like, "Hey, Mom, Dad, I'm called to preach. You know, y'all ought to come over and hear me preach." And
oh, I've heard a little bit of this.
my mom didn't tell me this until years later. She said, when you told us you was called to preach, she said, that night I got down on my knees and I said, "Dear God, my boy's confused. Please get through to him before he makes a fool out of himself. He has no business. He has no business. Lord, please." You know, she's just begging for God to spare me the embarrassment of trying to preach. Yeah, but I, you know, I mean, here I am nearly 20 years later still going. And, yeah, that was funny.
Yeah. What, you know, I think your humble beginnings were probably a little bit better than mine. This was back in the, you know, some people say this, they're going to hate me, but this was back in the days of what Sanchez referring to as the cult days. Is it an important one?
No, it's not important.
Just Missy?
No, it's a guy wanting to open the bookstore tomorrow while he's in town. So,
oh, yeah.
Yeah.
No, when, you know, we was in that church my wife was raised in, and, you know, basically when you felt called to preach, it was just something you just kind of felt God was doing in your life, you know. I mean, probably no different than what you felt. But I can remember, you know, it's like, man, I just had this desire to preach the gospel to a lost and dying world. But the way that it worked, the way our church was structured, like in the way when you went to church in the service, it was like an open meeting. There wasn't no time for singing, or like a certain you know, section of time, like here's the time we sing, here's the time we do this. Everything was just sprinkled in there, you know, however it was under the heading of led by the Spirit. So the first time, I don't know if I'd call it preaching, but the first time I read Scripture, so I stood up, you know. Man, I was so nervous, man. My heart's pounding. I was probably 19 or 20, something like that. And I stood up and I read this part, you know, here in Matthew, you know, he says, he's talking about even a bird doesn't fall to the ground that your heavenly Father doesn't know of, you know.
Yeah, right.
And my interpretation of that was, brethren, we're no better than the birds. God knows all about us too.
We're no better.
I kind of had it completely backwards. The only consolation I had was people weren't real red there, so nobody was really calling me out too hard. But
I remember I knew I was supposed to preach that. Well, here's the funny thing. This was probably the funniest thing about it. So we'd been going to church there for probably 3 or 4 years, and it was a big church, and that's where I wanted to go so I could blend in, because I'd been.
Oh yeah.
I didn't want to go some small church. The last church I was at, the pastor went out of town, and it had a lot of older people in it, and so the pastor went out of town, and he and I were going hunting together, and I said, "So you're going to be gone next week?" Yeah, going home, going to hunt back home. I said, "All right." I said, "So is your dad preaching for you next Sunday?" Because his dad was a pastor too. He goes, yeah, he'll preach Sunday morning, Sunday night. I was like, awesome, because I liked his dad. I like this guy. His name was John Evans. He's passed away now, but I loved him. And I said, so is your dad preaching next Sunday? He goes, yeah. I said, well, who's doing Wednesday night? He said, you are. This was when he got out of the car, I mean, it was like...
Is this at that Concord church?
No. This is a Kibler Baptist Church.
Okay.
I live just outside the little town of Kibler.
All right.
So I live out in the county, but... So he was the pastor there, and he said he was getting out of the car. We was driving back to his house from hunting, and I said, "Well, who's doing Wednesday night?" And he said, "You are." And I said, "No, who's doing Wednesday night?" And he gathering up his stuff. He said, "You're doing Wednesday night." And I said, "I've never done Wednesday night." He says, "It's time for you to start." And he shut the door and walked off. I went home. I want you to know what I had for a theological library. I had 1 volume of Matthew Henry's concise commentary on the whole Bible. There's only 2 volumes. So I had half the Bible.
So you got to choose out of that one.
Yeah. So I got that out, and I started reading through it. I don't even remember what I did. So anyways, I show up Wednesday night, and I was doing like RAs, and my wife was doing GA. So we were working with the little kids. Okay. Me and another guy and his wife and my wife had kind of split up. We were taking care of we're not old enough to be in the youth group yet, So long story short, I get up. Can you hear that in the microphone?
I can hear it. I don't know if they can hear it, but.
It's not picking up. Well, it sounds like they're sanding the floors next door. So anyways, so I show up on Wednesday night, and I'm sitting there in the service in the sanctuary, and I hear all the old people going, wonder who's preaching tonight. And they're like, I don't know. I don't know. And so I'm looking at my watch, and I'm just sitting, in the crowd. And somebody's like, surely Brother John scheduled somebody to be here to preach. I mean, they're standing up looking around the church. There's 35 people in there, maybe. It's Wednesday night. Pastor's gone, the kids and all the other people in the other building. And so I stand up because nobody asked me, what are you doing in here? So I didn't tell anybody I'm preaching. So I got up and I walked up to the podium and I said, well, Brother John's asked me to preach tonight or bring the message tonight. I don't think I said preach. I got up there and opened your Bibles up, and I went through my little spiel. It probably took me 30, 35 minutes, and the people were just sitting there kind of awestruck, And I said, just like you should on any Wednesday night, is there any questions about what we've covered tonight in the lesson? And this old man raised his hand. He goes, I got a question. And I said, okay. And he goes, why don't this young man have his own Sunday school class? He ought to be teaching the Bible every Wednesday night. He ought to have he ought to be pastoring a church. I mean, he was all but had me signed up for the ministry.
Oh my goodness.
And I was like, no, I don't want any of that. And so he sat down and the other person stood up and said, next business meeting, we're going to create a class for this young man to start teaching. And I was like, no, this young man don't want to be teaching no class, So when that was all over, my wife's like, well, how'd it go? I said, I'm not going back to church. She said, what? Was it that bad? I said, no, they loved it. I'm not going back to church. And I started dodging church, man.
Really?
And, yeah. And the reason was I was still in the National Guard. No, I wasn't. I just got out of the National Guard. So I used to miss a lot of church, and I used to work every other Sunday, used to be in the National Guard, so I missed a lot of service. I changed jobs. I was now working Monday through Friday, and I was out of the National Guard, so I was free every Sunday. So I was there a lot. I was active in the church.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to be that kind of active. You know, I didn't want to be a preacher, teacher, Sunday school teacher. Helping the little kids and doing that little thing was fun. So I kind of quit going to church. John, the pastor, my wife would call him up crying, he's not going to church. I know he's running from the Lord. That's what John would tell my wife, is that I'm running from the Lord.
Really?
And so anyways, fast forward, John leaves to go to another church. He's run his course there. He goes back closer to home. This is the furthest he'd ever been away from the area. He grew up in north central Arkansas. So he went back down in that direction. They just couldn't. It was a bunch of infighting, and I told my wife, I said, I'm tired of these small churches. I was in a small church when we were little, and then we went to a great big church. I said,
wow.
We need to go to a great big church. And the reason being, I can sit in the back row, and nobody's going to know what I'm even there. So that's when we bounced around. We went to several different churches, and she was like, you're not going to church. We're going to raise our kids in church. And I'm like, yeah, I've had enough Baptist, I'm done on Baptist for a while. And so anyways, we ended up at Concord, and I avoided Sunday school at all costs. I'd show up for church, and they just kept pestering us because we were a young couple with young kids, Y'all really ought to come to our Sunday school class. So we did. And I would sit in there, Ronnie, and they would say something just dumb, and I'd be sitting there thinking, that's not right. It's not what the Bible says. Matter of fact, the Bible actually says the opposite in about 12 verses, and so I'd just be sitting there, and they'd say, well, sometimes they'd see me just kind of shaking my head, and they go, Harold, do you disagree? And I'd be like, yeah, it clearly says in Romans 12. It clearly says in Hebrews 8. I'd be like, and I'd just be rattling stuff off, and they're like, where'd you get all that? And I'm like, I don't know. Well, you're right. And then it was like, you ought to be teaching this class. And I'm done with Sunday school. I kept getting thrusted into teaching.
Yeah.
And I just kept running from it and running from it and running from it. And that Sunday school class was running like 35 or 40. And they were just wanting to split it. And they kept, the pastor kept going, we got to split this class. Y'all all can't fit in there. And they were like, well, the guy that needs to teach it's Harold, but he don't want to. But he knows the Bible better than most of us do. And I just didn't want to, so they got a buddy of mine to teach it. And he said, I'll only do it if you're my assistant. I want somebody to back me up. And Steve was a great guy. He's a good dude. And he knew the Bible very well himself, and he studied and prepared. But he also would intentionally throw stuff off on me just because he wanted me to talk and teach. And so when they announced that I'm going to be preaching that Sunday night, the pastor, he's only been there like 2 weeks. He's new.
So what was the time frame from when you went there to the time you're going to preach now? Was it a year, 2 years?
A couple years, probably. What really convicted me, and there's a reason there's a bear hide hanging up in my office, is I was going to church in a large church of 400 or 500 people. In our part of the country, that's a pretty sizable church. A 400 or 500 member church, or attending church, is a pretty good sized church. And so I was bear hunting. And as I would be driving, we owned some property way back in the Ouachita, surrounded by national forest. And we would have to drive past this old church where my wife's grandparents went. It was closed, and it never could find a preacher. It even had his and hers outhouse out behind it. It was old, established in the 1800s, and it was closed.
Oh, wow.
And I was mad at God. I'm like, we were going through all these preachers coming in, filling the pulpit, because we were looking for a pastor. Our church, a pastor had been there 15 years, left. And these yahoos would get up and preach, and I'd just be getting fuming. I'm like, that's not what the Bible says. That's not, and the thing about it is they would get up and preach about how big and great God is and how powerful he is. And then they would all but beg sinners to respond.
Yeah.
And I'm like, if he's as big as you said he was 5 minutes ago, Why is he a beggar now? Why is he pleading that? I mean, why you just shrank him?
Yeah.
And so then I was looking at that little church, and I'm like, Lord, if you really love your church and you love your people, you'd send this church a pastor. And this answer I got back, I wouldn't say it was audible, but it rang in my head for months, was, what are you doing next Sunday? You don't like going to church anyways. Won't you come down here? I mean, that thought went through my head. I couldn't get out. I started driving the long way to the cabin so as I wouldn't have to go around the church. So when they announced in church that Harold Smith will be preaching, one of our own is going to preach for the first time tonight. Harold Smith's going to be preaching tonight at Concord, 6:00. The usher and one of the deacons that sat in front of me for 2 years leans over to his wife and goes, who the heck is Harold Smith? I was like, hey, dummy, I'm right behind you. You know, I wanted just to go, we shake hands every Sunday. And then I thought, Harold, that's why you came here, so you could hide and nobody would know who you are.
Yeah.
And so nobody knew who I was other than my Sunday school class. And they were all excited, like, boy, this is going to be good. He's finally going to get up and do it. And I was like, I don't really have nothing, you know. And I do remember my first sermon. I got up and preached on Gideon and in Judges 6.
Yep.
And he was the least in his family. His tribe was the least in Manasseh, and Manasseh was the least in Israel. And I was the most unlikely, unqualified. And I remember my little joke line that just popped through my head was like, I don't have a suit. All I have is a Bible and a half a commentary set of one book, half commentary set. And I don't even like fried chicken, so there's no way I can be a preacher. You know, I'm not kidding you, Ronnie. I've loved fried chicken for the last nearly 20 years, whereas I would never eat fried chicken beforehand. So when I popped off from the pulpit that I couldn't be a preacher because I didn't like fried chicken, I instantly got a taste for fried chicken. To the point that my wife's like, you always want to eat fried chicken. And I'm like, oh, man, you're right. And I used to hate it. And I'm like, oh, I've been qualified now. I mean, he's qualified to call, you know what I mean?
Man.
And so I preached on Gideon. I gave an invitation because that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to preach and invite people to come down front and get saved. I preached, stood down front. I said, if you'd like to respond, slip out in this aisle and come down front. I thought, boy, I'm doing pretty good. I've kind of said it all right. This 80-something-year-old, well, he's probably not 80. He was probably in his 70s, 70-something-year-old man because he's still living today. He's in his 90s. So he's in his 70s, 70-something-year-old pastor comes hobbling down the aisle to me, and I'm looking at him. I'm like, the bathroom's that direction. What are you coming down here for? He comes up and he shakes my hand. He puts his hand on my shoulder, and he's like, that's the greatest first sermon I've ever heard in my life, and I've heard a lot of first sermons.
Wow.
And he starts praying for me. And during the invitation, I'm the one getting prayed over. I'm the preacher. I'm supposed to be the one praying with them. This old man is sitting here, and it's like, God, I pray you put the anointing on him. I pray, God, that you feed him. You know, and I'm like, oh, okay. Oh, okay. It was spooky, kind of weird, you know. So I thought, well, hey, you know, I gave the invitation. One came forward. He's walking back to his seat. This other preacher slips out. He's probably in his late 60s. He comes walking down there. I'm like, what's he going to do? Says the exact same thing, Ronnie. Says, I just want to pray for you. So he's praying over me, and it's the same kind of prayer. You know, he's got his hands on me like he's anointing me, you know, laying hands on me. And I'm like, oh, wow. Now, I don't ever see any other preachers doing this to any of the other preachers, you know. So he goes back to his seat. The pastor comes down the aisle, does the same thing. I was like, this is weird. I don't know what to expect. Yeah. It's the only time I've ever given an invitation. But 3 preachers came forward. All 3 of them said it was the best first sermon they'd ever heard, that God had clearly gifted me to preach. I looked back at my mother after the 3rd pastor comes down front, my mother who had secretly prayed behind my back that God would get through to me. She's back there bawling, tears running down her eyes. My brother's back there teary-eyed. My mother-in-law and father-in-law are back there. I'm like, all right, I think you finally did what you're supposed to. I think I'm in the right spot. And I'll tell you, it gets even spookier than that. The church bought me a suit. So I came back Wednesday night for Bible study, and the pastor called me up front. And he said the deacons and I met Sunday after church. They called an emergency deacons meeting and said the church, we voted to take $250 or $300 out of the church budget and give it to you in a gift card to purchase a suit and a tie so you can actually look like a preacher from now on. So, and they licensed me to preach right then. They gave me a license and just a little certificate that said, you know, he's one of us. He can go preach. You don't have to worry about him. So then the pastor said, that was probably in March. The pastor said the Arkansas Baptist State Convention's in June. And it's in Little Rock. And he said, I'd like to take you down there and introduce you to some people and let you see how the Southern Baptist Convention works. And I was like, well, okay. So I had taken off. I had quit my job to preach. So I quit my job, was going to preach and mow grass, and bought a lawnmower. That way I could be flexible.
Right.
So I took off for 3 days with my pastor and his wife, me and my wife. She taught school. She was out for the summer. So we went to Little Rock to the Arkansas Baptist State Convention. Ronnie, we got down there. You know what a state convention's like. It's a backslapping event. It's a good old boy club. It's a, you know, all the, hey man, how are you? How's your church? It's pastors looking for churches.
Yeah.
So we get down there and we're walking around the convention center. Everybody's got their booth set up. You know, they're giving away ink pens and free books and come to our seminary. And we're walking around with our little bags full of trinkets, you know, keychains and flashlights and crap they're giving away. And we run into this guy and we're talking to him, you know, and he's like, so what are you doing? I said, I'm this young preacher called to preach. He said, he reached over and grabbed me on the shoulder. He goes, I have the strong urge to pray for you right now. I said, okay. And he prayed like them old men prayed, like my pastor prayed.
Really?
At the church. God, anoint this man with your spirit. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking over at my wife and I was like, whoa, that was weird. So we went a little further and it's just me and my wife walking around. We don't know anybody there. My pastor and his wife are talking to their friends from Mid-America Seminary or whoever, you know.
Yep.
We round the corner. We bump into this. We're standing there kind of waiting. Hey, how you doing? Hey, I'm fine. How are you? Where are you pastor at? I don't pastor. Well, what are you here? And I tell him what I'm doing. He goes, it'd be okay if I pray for you and your wife right now. And I said, sure. So we bow our head and he's praying for us. And so it's kind of the same kind of deal. And I was like, well, that was weird. So then we finally find Dale and Tammy, our pastor and his wife. They're like, are y'all having fun? I mean, you meeting people? I'm like, yeah, we're meeting people. So we're standing there talking to them. One of his friends comes walking up. Hey, man, how are you? He starts shaking hands. He introduced me. This is Harold Smith. He goes, can I just pray for you right now? And I was like, yeah. And I don't know. I just assumed this was like a prayer meeting because this is like the 4th time we've been prayed for in one day by 4 different people we never met before. This dude starts praying for us. So Missy and I are sitting there, and Dale and my pastor and his wife and this new guy, and they're all praying for me and the anointing and all this. And I was thinking, this is just weird, you know. But I was like, well, that must be what Southern Baptists, you know, we're men of prayer, we're men of the book, you know, we're number one in missions. I don't know any better. Fast forward through this whole ordeal. We're at the last thing is like a Mid-America alumni luncheon. I didn't go to any kind of college. So my pastor did, and he's eating there, so he got us tickets. So everybody's like, when did you graduate? I'm like, oh, I didn't.
Still working on it.
Still working on it. Yeah, I just entered the ministry. You know, my pastor's here. We rode with them. We got to ride back with them like 2 times. I mean, this went on all through this thing. So we end our time at the state convention. Somebody from his school goes, hey, before y'all run off, let me pray for this young man and his wife. And so they're praying. We're all standing there, and we get in the car to leave, you know, after he prays for us. It's like 5 or 6 people prayed for me like that. Wow. I never met. So we get in the car, and I said, Dale, I've never been prayed for so many times in all my life. He goes, me neither. I've been coming to Arkansas State conventions for years. He goes, we've never had prayer in the hallway. He goes, that happened 2 times with you. And my wife's like, no, it happened like 6 or 7 times with us. He goes, you mean other than the people I introduced you to? Because he said, I introduced you to 2 people that just had to pray with you. And I said, everybody we've had a conversation with.
Man.
And I said, is that normal? He goes, absolutely not. I mean, he's looking at us all bug-eyed, and I'm like, well, that was weird.
Man. I don't know if I want to use the word weird or spooky or what, but I mean, that's really neat. I mean,
well, I look back on it, Ronnie, and I'm like,
huh. I mean, I think
I've
God
been
was
to a lot
making
of
it clear.
I've been to a lot of conventions since, and I'm not in the convention anymore. I mean,
right.
I'm past that now, but I never ever went back to one where people just wanted to pray, and it wasn't like I praise the Lord for this young brother. Pray you bless him, amen. You know, it was, it was like a Southern black preacher. Oh God, anoint this young man with your word, with your spirit, empower him, gift him, Lord. I mean, it was these kind of prayers. People I never met. I couldn't give you one of them's name.
Man. I think the Lord was making it very clear that, I'm calling you to preach.
Yeah.
I mean, you take all that whole story in there, and it's like, good day.
Yeah.
I mean,
not to mention Vestal Goodman when I was.
That right there may be the capstone of it all, right there.
I was 9 years old.
Being smothered by Vestal, prophesied over.
I mean, she was a big woman. That was probably at her, I honestly said her height, but that was probably at her width of her career.
Yeah.
Hey,
man. I mean, the weird thing is, I mean, she's really just in line with all these other people. They're in line with what she did.
She was a forerunner.
Well, that helps me understand some things. It's like, my goodness, you got Vestal Goodman, you got all these people praying for you. It's like, no wonder you preach like you do.
I don't know, man. It just, and it was the same way, like with the pastor fellowships and stuff I hold, those things just kind of fell in my lap. I didn't go out looking for them. It was just like, next thing you know, there was a bunch of us hanging around, and this is what we did.
That's really interesting, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, you grew up in church, right?
Oh, yeah. 9 months before I was born. Yeah.
Yeah, see, my background was this. We weren't in church. My mom had been raised Church of Christ, and my dad was, pretty violent person, especially towards her. And when she left him, she was basically told, or it was implied that, you got to stay here, or basically you have no hope. I mean, I don't know if they said it quite like that, but that was the message she got. So we didn't go to church. She kind of had the mind that, well, I'm not going to heaven, but at least I know, what the right church is. Well, my only thing about church growing up, I think I was like in the 2nd grade, and I had my best friend tell me he got baptized. And I didn't know what it was, and he says, yeah, you got to do it by the time you're 16 or you go to hell,
He gave you a deadline.
Oh, my goodness, and I wasn't near 16, but I was thinking, man, I don't even go to church. I got to get there somehow.
Get the calendar out. We don't want to miss this.
Yeah, so, but what happened was, about the time I was 16, I was 16, my mom got saved. We started going to a little church right up the road from us, and it was that same time that I met my wife. So my whole church background was just condensed into a few months, and then I met Randy, my wife, and the only connection we had was, we were both in a little small church by our house. Now, she didn't tell me much about hers. Now, the weird thing was, when she did tell me about it, she told me this. She said, we don't believe in doctors. And I said, well, how dumb is that? I said, they're everywhere.
You mean like they don't exist?
Yeah.
You were thinking they don't exist, and she was like, no, we don't use them.
Yeah. And that catches your attention. But the thing of it is, it's amazing what God does in people's lives. Like, just listening to your story, like, I look at mine, and my conversion in the Baptist church, I was a false convert.
This is when you were 16?
Yeah, 16, and we had walked the aisle and, got baptized that Sunday night. And I mean, when we got baptized, me and my brother and my little neighbor kid, we couldn't wait to get outside and just have cuss fest, Like, we got to get out of here, man. I don't think that one took, But what ended up happening was I started going to church with her, and when I say a cult, I don't mean the Jim Jones type thing. I mean when you're exclusive, you're saying you're the only one, nobody else has got it right but you, everybody else is lost, that type of thing,
Yeah.
But the crazy thing is even in that, God was working with me. I mean, I can remember
There's nobody too far gone. There's nobody that's unreachable.
No, and I find it interesting that these men, as soon as you said, I've been called to preach, they're immediately saying, hey, I want you to preach. I'm still very much like that. I still have this thing in me that says the best way to learn to preach and to really know if you've been called, you've got to get in there and do it. But we live in a time where everybody wants to examine you and run you through a 3-year course,
Well, no, not everybody, just the reform guys.
Okay, well, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of people. But
yeah. Isn't it funny the people that believe God's sovereign and control of all things are scared to death that God might make a mistake and somebody might slip through the cracks and accidentally join their church that could possibly turn out to be lost years down the road?
Yeah. And now this is
might stand up to preach and maybe not be called to preach. So let's put them through a course and
exactly
take 8 years of their life away.
And it's not only that, Harold, but it's like when it's talking about making disciples, they're wanting to make disciples of them.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, that's not what he meant,
So many of these churches haven't baptized anybody in years. All they do is still Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
I see that. I see that being a big problem, and especially in Reformed churches.
Yeah. Well, also, and I do understand this, but like, say somebody gets saved, well, they'll have them go through a 6-month, like, we're gonna watch you like through a microscope,
just like Peter on Pentecost.
Yeah, yeah, something like that.
Just like Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch.
Yeah, and I do understand, because they say, well, there's false converts in the church. Guess what? There's always been. But there's always going to be.
Yeah, there's a way to deal with them called Matthew 18, 1 Corinthians 5.
Exactly. So, like I told somebody just the other day, I don't know who I was talking to, but I said, look, it doesn't matter if you go through a full year with somebody. I said, I've known people that for years looked the part, and then they wigged out, and it's like, man, that's, it just blows you away. But I'm not God. I'm not the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
All I can go on is their profession.
Baptizing them up on their profession of faith.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, this is something that I really, I was talking about doing podcasts like this, or you and I just going to talk for a while. I watched the Tucker Carlson podcast with Willie Robertson of the Duckmen.
Oh, yeah.
And, they're Church of Christ.
Right.
And they'll baptize you just as soon as you say, I do, And, but one of the things I think that we've lost as Baptists is we're so scared of being Church of Christ or easy believism. We've lost that motivation to get people saved and baptized. It's almost like, I know you say you want to be saved, but do you really want to be saved? Instead of saying, well, here's water, what hinders them from being baptized?
Right. Yeah, matter of fact, it wasn't 6 months ago to a year ago, something like that. It just hit me. I thought, we have gotten to the point where we want to make sure so hard that nobody's coming forward or nothing. And it's almost like, oh, yeah, I forgot. We do save people. I mean, people get saved and baptized,
Yeah.
And
it's like the invitation system. Is that Sam Elliott? No, it's just a white-haired guy with a big mustache.
It could be him.
Might be.
Maybe he'll come in. Man.
Maybe he'll come and get on the podcast.
Yeah.
Maybe we can get saved. Maybe we'll baptize him before he takes off.
I had a young lady in my church get saved about 2 or 3 months ago. Her dad is from, I want to say Pakistan or something. He's Muslim. Her mom, I don't want to say she converted, but for the peace in the family, she did the Muslim thing through all of this girl's growing up.
Right.
Well, then right before her mom died, she's like, no, I believe in Jesus, and I mean, really good testimony. But this young lady had been coming to our church for almost a year, and she'd come most of the time. There was a family that had moved there, and she's cousins with the wife. And man, she's coming, and you're gonna love this. She said she always liked to hear me preach. She loves it because she said my voice is so soothing.
Oh,
yeah. I said she seems to be an educated girl, but I don't think she knows what that word means. But the crazy thing was I get a text one night from her brother-in-law, and he says, "Hey, can you call?" Her named her off, and I'm thinking, man, this is 11:15. I'm not just calling some lady up,
Yeah.
And I said, does she know I'm calling? And he's like, yeah. So I called her up, and I said, what's going on? And she starts off with this. She said, well, she said, I need to be baptized. And I'm like, I'm like, okay, well, why do you need to be baptized? She said, well, I had a dream. So I'm like,
okay.
Oh boy, this is getting worse for me.
It's like...
And I said, well, tell me what happened. And then she said this. She said, I had this dream, and she said, all I know is this. I know that Jesus is God. She said, everything in me, to the very last fiber of the last atom of my body, everything has changed. And she said, and I'm scared. I said, what do you mean you're scared? And she goes, my whole worldview has changed. I said, well, every Christian gets to deal with that,
Yeah.
But, she told me about the dream, and I said, well, because I'm still a little,
7 lean cows and 7 fat cows and 7 ears of corn.
So get this. I said, well, tell me about your dream. She said, I was out in this, I don't remember if she said a field or something, but she said, I was praying to God, and she said, if this is real, and what she's talking about is Jesus really God? She said, because her previous testimony was, there's no way I will ever believe that.
Right.
And she said, if this is real, show me. And she said, I'm not saying I heard an audible voice or nothing. She said, but this is the way it was in the dream. She said, it's like his hand touched my heart, and he said, you know that I am. Now, when she said that, I was like, what? Because I had visited with her enough. It wasn't like she was a Bible scholar at this point, for sure,
Right.
And I said, do you even understand that I am statement, and like in the Bible? And she's like, no. And so I tell her a little bit. But the thing was that caught me off guard was I thought, it has been so long since somebody has came by way of salvation.
Yeah.
And I was just like, I thought, Lord, what's wrong with us? I mean, have we just forgot, What have we done? What have we made it that people just aren't, and I know God is sovereign. It's not like what we're doing, but
right.
What are we missing here?
That's what I picked up in that interview. And I mean, it's Tucker Carlson and Willie Robertson. They're talking politics.
Yeah.
But the thing I took away is Willie Robertson's like, I wrote a book called The Gospel. I think it's called The Gospeler or Gospeller. But he said it's really about my dad. He just goes around sharing the gospel with people. And I first met the Robertsons long time before Duck Dynasty ever came out. They were just selling duck calls. And I had sat down and talked to Phil Robertson just like you and I are sitting down talking.
Really?
Yeah, but he wasn't famous.
Yeah.
And it was at the Fort Smith Civic Center. It was a wild game, or not a wild game, it was a outdoor expo. So there were boats and campers, and all the sporting goods companies had their, booths set up, and we knew about them because we used their duck calls. I used to be really big into duck hunting in the early 90s, 91, 92. And so they had videos out called The Duck Men of Louisiana. And I mean, it was real duck hunting. They were chewing tobacco and spitting out of the duck blind. They were shooting deer in the water waist deep, and I thought, these guys are like us. So when my buddy called me, he goes, they're going to be in Fort Smith. And we had VHS tapes, that we had watched of them. So we go over there, and they're just sitting in a chair. Hey, it's just Phil and his wife. Yeah. Hey, how you doing? Oh, good, man. How are y'all? And so we start talking to them, and most people don't even know who they are. They're not famous.
Right.
All they're doing is making duck calls. Long story short, we sit there and talk to him. He says, well, I got to go up here and do a duck demo. So he goes up there, does a duck call demonstration, goes through all of his calls, puts them back in the bag, drops the bag down, reaches over and picks up the Bible, opens it up, goes to Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And he starts preaching on creation. And I'm like, this guy here is a solid dude, you know? I mean, he's just laying it out. And he said it is a lie that we evolved. It is a denial of a creator. And I mean, he is just thumping the Bible. And I mean, going down the line, and mankind's born a sinner. Mankind needs a savior. You know, you men here like to hunt and fish. You go out into the woods. You know that thing didn't evolve, and you didn't evolve either. And you're accountable to the same guy that made it. I mean, he just going down the line.
Wow.
And I'm like, man, this dude's a good preacher. So he gets to the end of it. He says, now, if you believe that, if you believe there is a God and his son's name, Jesus Christ, and you got to repent of your sins and believe on him. So I'm like, yeah, he's preaching a good gospel. He goes, you do that? He goes, we'll walk across the street, walk down the river bank, and I'll baptize you in the Arkansas River right now. I was like, well, why would you do that? I mean, I'm a Baptist. They should go join a church and get baptized and become a member of a church, not just you walk across the river, walk over 1 block over to the river and baptize them. So I thought, I bet he's one of those Church of Christ. You know, I didn't know much about him, but I knew that you had to be baptized to be saved in their religion. So I went over to him after it was over. I mean, nobody was talking to him. I think the people that did like him, I think he scared them off when he preached. And I said, are you Church of Christ? He said, we just preached God's word to him, son. And I said, but you talk all this talk about baptism. You got to be Church of Christ. He goes, we just preach the gospel. You know, who wouldn't want to get baptized? And I couldn't argue with that. He goes, if you genuinely believe, why wouldn't you want to identify with the Lord in baptism? You know, and I was like, okay. I was like, I still think you're Church of Christ. Well, then they start selling more duck calls. He gets invited to speak at all these places, and come to find out, everywhere he goes, he presents the gospel. And so this was his deal. He said, we will come and sell duck calls, and I'll get up and talk and do whatever. And if you let me share the gospel, we'll do it free of charge. If you don't, I charge $2,000. Well, $2,000 or he gets to preach at the end. Let him preach, you know.
Yeah.
And so the longer this went on, the more and more I got to know them. I'm like, yeah, they're definitely Church of Christ. They all went to Church of Christ colleges. But they do preach good. I mean, they preach a good gospel. They reach men where they are, and they baptize a lot of people. And they've got some real, genuine, converted people behind them.
Wow.
And I'm like, we miss that. Reformed people miss that. We're so scared to death somebody might accidentally get on the roll that shouldn't be on the roll that I think we push people that would over to these guys that are ready to take them and preach to them.
Yeah. No, I think you're right about that. I've had to ask myself before, I'm like, what am I afraid of here? And I really don't know. I mean, I don't know if it's when I started understanding like Reformed doctrine and such. And let me say this. When I say Reformed doctrine, I may not even know what I'm talking about, to be quite honest.
Yeah. You're talking about a Presbyterian in sheep's clothing.
Well, I mean, probably, because all I know is that when I came to what we call the doctrines of grace, in my mind, it was just like, oh, that's Reformed doctrine, But the more I kind of learned about that, I thought, well, I'm not that, and I'm not that.
Yeah, right, me too.
And so, but even with that, I've had to just, in the past few years, and I thank the Lord. I'll say it like this. I want to say it biblically right. I thank God that our paths did cross, because probably not directly from your part, but indirectly, you kind of helped me get back to just being me instead of trying to be somebody that I really wasn't, trying to polish up those rough edges I have or whatever.
Right.
And I thought, that's just not me.
Right.
And I probably went through a couple of years, like maybe more than that, like that, trying to learn how to do proper outlines, and man, I just don't preach like that.
Yeah.
Well,
it's natural to want to be part of a group.
Yeah.
So when the church I pastored pulled out of the Southern Baptist Convention, the director of missions called me, and man, he called me everything but a preacher of the gospel. I mean, I don't think he used any cuss words, but he all but did. He told me I was a cult leader. He said, "Yes, you're never going to amount to anything. All you're ever going to do is pastor that little church right there. You're going to have 5 or 6 people that think you're it, and all the rest of us are going to know better." And I was like, "Oh, okay." So, man, I was motivated. I'm like, I'm not a cult leader. I'm going to pastor this church the rest of my life. And if 5 or 6 is all we got, then that's all I need, I guess. So, but I was like, I really need to be in some kind of group because they've kicked me out of this one. I told them I wasn't coming back, and I thought I just wouldn't send in the money and I wouldn't go to the meetings, but I'd still be friends with all the preachers.
Yeah.
Because they all said I was a great preacher. They all said I had a lot of potential. They all said, man, this guy's a good dude, as long as he's sending in the money, So when we terminated our interest in that, then I lost all my friends. And so, Ronnie, I went hunting for a group to join. And twice a month, I got the Sword of the Lord newspaper sent to me from Murfreesboro, Alabama, whether I wanted it or not. And these guys were old-timey,
Yeah.
This is old-timey guys. So I said, this must be the camp for me, because they were always bashing on the Southern Baptist Convention. And so I loaded up my wife, and we went to Murfreesboro to a conference. And I was going to go out there, and this was going to be my group. And I got, these guys old-timey. So I got out there.
That was interesting.
I got out there. I was so eye-opened, and I'll tell you what they did. It was a Friday night, Saturday conference. It was a men's conference. So my wife just kind of lounged around the motel, and I went to this men's conference Friday night and Saturday. And the pastor of the church, this is a big church in Murfreesboro. I think the guy's name was Mike Franklin, or maybe it's Franklin Road, and his name was Mike something else. I don't remember. Mike Norris, okay. Franklin Road Baptist Church. I mean, this is a ginormous church. So he comes up to me Saturday, and he goes, "I understand you're a pastor from Arkansas. I understand that you have left Southern Baptist Convention." Yeah, and he's just all into me, right? And I'm like, yeah, that's right. And he goes, "Man, I'm so glad you're here. If you need anything, you let me know." He hands me his business card. We're here to help you in any way. If they give you any trouble, you call us. We got lawyers. We'll help you. We'll defend you if they try to take your church.
Oh, wow. I
was like, they're not going to do any of that. And so anyways, my wife and I go back Sunday morning to go to church there. And I'm like, honey, you got to hear these guys. They're going to help us. This church, I don't know how many people are there. I'm going to guess 1,500 people are in this place. Not counting the Hispanic service going on in another building, and not counting the children's church. I mean, this is a gigantic sanctuary. So he's up there making announcements before the service starts. We're about to shake hands, I welcome. He says, "We've got some very special guests today." Said Harold and Melissa Smith are here. He's a pastor from Van Buren, Arkansas at Lee Creek Baptist Church. Harold and Missy, where are y'all? Stand up, please. Oh, no. And so we stand up, and he said, "They've left the Southern Baptist Convention. Let's give them a hand." And so 1,500 people are clapping for me and my wife. And we're standing up, and I'm like, what in the world? And he said, "Let's go around and shake hands, and y'all go by and thank them for standing on the word of God." I felt like Abraham Lincoln the day he won the election. I had more people shaking my hands, patting me on the back. I thought, man, I said, baby, they love us out here in Murfreesboro. This is the place to be, And then when he got up to preach, all he did was rail on Calvinism for about 45 minutes. And I'm like, I'm confused. I thought they was old-timey, And so we made our rounds, and the Lord's like, made it clear, this is not your group. So I went to the Reform camp. I went to their meetings, and I tried them, and I'm like, this ain't the group. And it finally come to the conclusion, I just don't fit in any group. I can be friends with guys in every group, but the Lord somehow got it through to me. I don't have to be in somebody's group.
Yeah.
I wanted to fit in so bad, but it just wasn't.
And there is some of that. I mean, that really, I mean, we do want to have fellowship and fit into places and such. So,
what time do you need to get out here?
You're
good?
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay, I just don't want you to be late. I know. We could put you up overnight, but I don't think that's what you want to do.
My wife would be like, "What?"
Oh man, but I mean that desire, you know, when you get out of one group, you want to go get in another. Other guys like get out of a group and they're like, I don't want to be a part of nothing. It's just our church versus the world.
Right.
You know, and that's wrong too.
Yeah.
I really like the BMA, the Baptist Missionary Association of Arkansas, and the BMA of America. In my mind, the association model is the right way for collective churches to work together. You know, it's got enough structure that you can accomplish stuff that one church couldn't, but it's not the convention model where when you walk up to the microphone, you're out of order, you know, go sit down. The bureaucrats are running the show. You don't get that. So it's a more balanced structure, but it allows churches to work together, because when we left the convention and I never could fit in anywhere, I never united Lee Creek with any other group. It was just Lee Creek versus the world. And I hosted a conference every year for preachers. I mean, you've preached in it, Preachers of Grace Conference. Mm-hmm. We probably had 100 pastors come through that in 11 or 12 years. We'd have 50 or 60 every year towards the end. That was the circle of friends, but there was no real help there. You know, if I got ran over by a freight train, what are they going to do?
Right.
And so a lot of churches that I've helped along over the years, their pastor would tell them, now, hey, look, something happens to me, y'all call Harold Smith. And I'm like, well, what happens after Harold Smith? Something happens to him, you know?
Yep.
A church really needs to be in some kind of fellowship with other churches.
Yeah, and I think the key word right there is in fellowship. It's just like in the association that our church is. Now, we're SBC, and, you know, we got our, what do we call ours? The South Canadian Baptist Association.
Canadian A.
Yeah, hey. And, you know, there's 30 churches, so, you know, it should be 30 pastors. I think there's a couple that don't have a pastor right now, but that fellowship part, you know, and now I like I said, I didn't grow up in church, and I never was part of a denomination really. Now at Sovereign we were, but I don't think they liked us a whole lot, so we never really felt like it. So I come over here though, and it's a little more active, and I thought, well, okay, I'm in this. You know, instead of just doing nothing, I'm going to try to fellowship and stuff. Sometimes I wonder if I don't scare people, you know, because, well, just like when we talk, I mean, I just say what I think, you know,
right.
and you know, and you do the same thing. Man, most people don't seem to be used to that or comfortable. And I'm just like, man, guys, if we're going to really have fellowship, we've got to start, you know, and because here's one of the things I hear a lot. I feel alone. I feel like I don't have no fellowship, you know, the very
you
word.
don't, because you're living your life trapped in this little box in your hand.
And I'm like, guys, when you're going through stuff, you're struggling with things, you know, this conflict, or in the past, you know, the other podcast, call somebody. I guarantee you somebody's probably gone through it, going through it, you know. That was one thing about the Preachers of Grace, especially when I first came to it. It was like, here's this group of pastors, and you would sit at the table with each other, and somebody invariably would be going through something.
Yep.
And there's 4 or 5 other guys, you know, everybody's willing to step up and say, hey man, I've been there, you know, and you know, and you're able to know that, hey, I'm not the only guy going through this, you know. Yeah. And but it's just the fellowship part needs to be emphasized on that.
Well, that's what made that conference so much different from every other conference. You know, if you go to G3, you're going to hear some awesome preachers. You're going to be able to go some booths and get some great giveaways.
Yep.
But you're probably going to go eat lunch with the 4 people you know that are there.
Oh, yeah.
You know, at Preachers of Grace, you're going to go through and get a free lunch because we provide everything, and you're going to sit down at a table with probably people you don't even know until then.
I'll tell you what it's like. It's like when you go, it's not just the big dogs, you know, the names that you're there to hear, but even it's like a pecking order after that. You know, he's talking about going to churches that had run 1,500 and stuff. It's like they always ask, like, hey, how big is your church? And they'll say, oh, my church is really small. We only run about 200 or 300. And I'm like, so that's small. Yeah. Yeah, we're a micro church. We run about 40, 50, you know. And you can almost feel, and then you get into the, well, where'd you go to school? Stratford High School. Yeah. Barely graduated.
Yeah, right.
18th out of 28, you know. And I was in the top 20.
Yeah.
And you can feel that, I mean, maybe the word's condescending type thing, you know.
Yeah.
And whereas, you know, I meet somebody and I'm real big about this. I'll see a guy that looks like he's by himself, and I'll just try to go and say, "Hey, man, you going to lunch anywhere? Yeah, you can come with us." You know,
right? And
maybe, you know, because I may have been there before. You know, and it's like I see people like that.
Yeah.
And you start really getting to know people, and just, you know, I always just ask them, "Man, how'd you come to the Lord?" You know, just start talking.
Start talking to them, and
yeah,
I think that's, I don't know. I think as a country, we're becoming more and more introverted all the time.
Yeah, the introverts, God love them. God help them, you know.
Well, God rescue them if they're going to be a pastor, you know. You have to be able to go out and entertain strangers is literally what the command is.
Yeah.
You know, being hospitable is entertaining strangers. And I see so many pastors that are just entertaining their circle. And sometimes their circle within a circle.
Right.
And that's, I don't know, that's just the problem.
Yeah. You've got to get out of your comfort zone. You know, think about the guys that you know that kind of have a name. And you don't, you know, sometimes you don't know how to approach them. You know, you don't know what they're going to be like. Well, sometimes they can be a total jerk. You're like, well, that wasn't fun. Yep. But then when that guy comes across in a very humble way, like he's just you. He's just one of, you know, a guy like you, you're kind of blown away.
Yeah.
And that's the guys that I want to be like, you know. Not that I'm anybody, probably never will, you know, be somebody like don't care to be.
Right.
But I always want to make sure that, you know, that the guy that feels like he's less than, feels left out, I want to make sure them guys feel welcome. You know, hey, man, you're as much a part of this as anybody.
Yeah.
And
I've just hated the guys that thought they were, you know, they had arrived. You know, like in an entourage. And some of them want an entourage so bad that they surround themselves with idiots just to walk around with them like it's their entourage.
Yeah, I've seen it. I've seen it. And I mean, it's so bad because I'm thinking, man, I've got to be embarrassed for them because I don't think they got a sense to be embarrassed, you know. And
but you know, you're talking about guys that, you know, are nationally known. Let's just say it that way.
Yeah,
they're nationally known, and there's different degrees of nationally known, and some of them are only nationally known within their little circle. But John MacArthur, if you are in Christianity, you know, if you go to church every day, every time the doors are open, you know the name John MacArthur, whether you're Church of Christ, Methodist, or a Baptist, right?
Yeah, everybody.
He's been on Larry King Live. You know, he's been on national TV shows. He's written tons and tons of books. His chief editor, the director of his ministry, is Phil Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And people may not know Phil Johnson, may not be a household name, but if you're a pastor, you know Phil Johnson.
Yep.
He's the kind of guy that I would say is, and I'm going to single him out because I've met him on a number of occasions, and I've been in his office, and he's an average, ordinary dude. It's not like, you know, he holds his kiss the ring. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Sit thou in the small seat until I call for you. You know, he's not that kind of guy. It's, hey, man, how you doing? How you been? It's good to see you. Good to talk to you again. Hey, you know, and he's genuinely interested. And I'll just give you an example. So I had some friends that were at Shepherd's Conference, and they had Airbnb reserved, and when they got there were people in it. They were already moved in.
Oh man!
And so they called the Airbnb. You know, they're like, "Hey, we're here. We got our reservation." They say they got theirs, and they're like, "It was a computer glitch. It's double booked." And
Should have been quicker.
yeah, and they were like, "We'll try to find you something else." Well, there ain't nothing else. It's Shepherd's Conference. There people come from all over the world for this week. So one of the guys that's there calls me and says, "Can you call any of your friends over at Grace to You?" You know, that's John MacArthur's ministry. That's Shepherd's Conference is a pastor's conference.
So, now you're in Arkansas.
I'm in Arkansas.
Okay.
And so I'm like, dude, I'm not like, I don't just call up people at Grace to You, John MacArthur's ministry, and go, "Hey, it's Harold. That problem, I want some answers." You know, I don't do that. But I do have a couple phone numbers, you know. So I got a buddy named Fred Butler.
Yeah, I know Fred. I've talked to him quite a bit.
Fred Butler's a super good dude. I've been in his home, you know. I thought, well, maybe I'll text Fred, see if he's got any leads, you know. So I text Fred. Fred goes, "You need to talk to Phil." And I was like, "Phil Johnson?" And he goes, "Yeah." He goes, "Hang on just a minute." So 10 minutes later, Phil Johnson's texting me. "Hey, who are they? Where are they at?" What? And so we're going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And I'm like, he's the executive director of Grace to You. They're putting on a conference for 5,000 preachers. He's texting a guy in Arkansas the night before the conference starts, trying to help 4 preachers from Arkansas and Oklahoma find a place to stay on a moment's notice.
Yeah.
I can't imagine many guys in his position that interested in helping them. And so finally, they get them a room that night somewhere 2 hours away, and they got to truck it back the next morning. Then they get them into a place closer. And the next morning, 7 o'clock my time, 5 o'clock California time, I'm getting a text message from Phil. Let me know if what they got last night didn't work and they need a place closer. I'm still looking.
Wow.
5 o'clock in the morning, he's messaging me back.
Yeah.
And I mean, we've only talked a few times, you know. I've been in his office a few times, or one time. We've talked face-to-face a few times. We've messaged each other a few times. But to have that kind of genuine concern for some people whose reservations got messed up, when you're responsible for an entire 5,000-person conference.
Yeah, no kidding.
My secretary will call them. You know, that would be that was what you would expect to hear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just sitting there thinking about the part of 5,000, people come to this conference. I'm thinking about the stress I get just trying to do our conference.
Yeah, me too.
And we were a little bit short of 5,000, but we were inching there. So yeah, I mean that's and that's the stuff right there. It's like, I don't care. Listen, if you got a name, it's only because God gave you a platform,
Right?
And you need to. And I've heard this about John MacArthur. I'm not going to say who the other guy was, but this guy was comparing the two, and he said, "This guy's an absolute jerk." And he said, "But I'll tell you who's not." And he said, "John MacArthur." He said, "You meet him, he's always the most gentle, kind,
Yeah.
And I'll tell you something else. When you talk about everybody knows John MacArthur, you're the guy in our generation when everybody starts off goes, "Well, I don't agree with MacArthur on everything."
Yeah.
They don't say that about anybody else. It's
right.
only John MacArthur.
That's right. Nobody says I don't agree with T.D. Jakes on everything.
Exactly.
Well, here's the another guy I'll mention, and I've met him at face to face, and we've talked one time. Is Todd Friel of Wretched Radio.
Yep.
So it's a nationally syndicated radio program, or at least it was. I don't know if it still is. It's on the air. It's on the internet now. I know that. It's on TV. I get an email from him one time, and I'm thinking it's just, kind of a generic thing. I'm like, why is Wretched Radio? It says Todd at Wretched, and it opens up and it says, "Dear Pastor Smith," and I'm thinking, okay. And he says, I had someone reach out to me the other day. It said they live in your area and they're not going to church because all the churches are fake and nobody preaches the Bible there. So they're just getting their church on the internet. And he said, "I'm sure you will agree that's not a proper way to attend church." I got online and looked in the area and found your church. From all I see online, it appears your church is a Bible-believing, gospel-preaching church. I've sent them your information. I've told them that Christians go to church and then they should try this church. And he said, and I'm just paraphrasing, this has probably been 15 years ago. He said, I mean, but it's a lengthy, and you can tell it's not some form letter. You know, he's typed it out. So he gives me her name, describes her family, and, you know, they've had 2 kids. And he said, and I'm sure you and your people will be friendly, but for my sake, be extra friendly. You know, because I'm recommending them. And if they don't show up Sunday, would you be so kind as to email me back and let me know so that I can touch base with them again and find out why they're not going to church?
Wow.
And I was like, whoa. Well, guess what? They showed up Sunday.
Really?
They loved it. They went to our church for the rest of the time I was the pastor there. I messaged Todd back, and I said, hey, they showed up. They seemed to enjoy it. Thanks for recommending us. You know, appreciate it. He emails me back because I thought, I'll just let him know everything's okay. He said, no, I got an email from them, already read it. They did. They enjoyed it. They think, and so I'm like, here's a guy that's running a nationally syndicated ministry, airing 5 days a week on the radio. Right. He's on television channels. It's not his secretary.
Yeah.
It's him. And I'm like, who takes that kind of interest in a little small family in Western Arkansas?
Yeah. I love that. I mean, I love to hear stuff
I've
like
told that story before. I'll keep telling it.
Yeah. I'll tell
because
that one now that I know
I know a half a dozen guys that wouldn't do anything close to that are well-known, nationally known writers and scholars. And
yeah.
I just don't. So I love those guys. I love guys like that,
right.
You know, in the ministry.
Right.
But I used to think, and I could be wrong about this, but I used to think you shouldn't ever get that popular.
No, you
know what I mean? Like me, like I used to tell people, I don't ever want to be famous. And they're like, well, that's because you're not, you know? And, but I really don't. I mean, somebody said, you just criticize G3 because you don't preach there. And I said, no, I don't want to preach there. And if I'm ever getting paid that kind of money to go speak to a group of people one time, just cancel all my missionary support, you know?
Yeah.
I don't want that kind of ministry. I don't want to be that kind of famous.
Well, you know, the thing of it is, I probably would agree that the guy said you think that because you've never been. I have a fear that if you ever got a taste, I mean, anybody, me, you, got a real taste of that,
it would ruin us.
Because I see what happens to people. And I think I've told you this before, but I remember, back when Tiger Woods was, killing it in golf, and somebody said, man, I wish I was Tiger Woods. And I said, not me. All these guys said, yeah. And I said, not me. And they said, you're lying. I said, no. They said, why do you say that? And I said, I want to be the guy that finished 25th. They said, who's that? And I said, I don't know. He made a lot of money. He got to play free golf, and ain't nobody bothering him today.
That's right. That's right. He don't have all the problems that come along with it.
Think about this. Can you imagine that if everything you and I said was put out there to be put under a microscope?
No, I couldn't.
Oh, we'd be in so much trouble, brother.
It's just my ministry is to churches.
Right.
I minister to pastors. I have a big portion of what I do is try and encourage and equip pastors, but that's not people paying to come hear me preach.
Right.
I don't ever want to go where they charge a fee for me to preach. You know what I mean? Or exactly. I get a portion of money that they've collected because I'm coming to preach. And so I'll go do these revivals, and they'll take up an offering.
Yeah.
And they're like, it ain't much. I'm like, it's enough. Whatever you give is enough. What do you charge? I don't charge.
Yeah. Now, see, that church that I started out in, nobody got paid. There was no paid ministry anywhere. We preached hard against it, condemn everybody that did it. We were So when I would go preach, it wasn't like somebody invited you to come preach. You went to preach somewhere as you felt God was leading you. You never expected money. Now, sometimes, not every time, but, sometimes you'd get the $20 bill handshake or something like that.
Right.
I did have a couple of occasions where the church just took up money. I mean, this was very odd. It wasn't like a normal thing, but it was at that time, it was a lot of money, you know, for me. But the thing of it is, I remember leaving that church, and it was the first time I went and preached, and I went out to DeWitt, Arkansas, and I just went there for that weekend, like just a Sunday. Ended up having services all through the week. I mean, I think till Wednesday or Thursday.
So it was just a spontaneous, like, revival type meeting.
Kind of, but they were like, can you stay another night? Can you stay another night? You know, and I was like, okay, you know. But now I was kind of used to that format, you know, where I came from.
Right.
So it wasn't something that, you know, like freaked me out. So I did, and then they get to the end of this thing, and in front of me, I'd never heard of a love offering. I didn't know what they were talking about. And they said, we want to take up a love offering for Brother Ronnie. It embarrassed. I don't get embarrassed hardly over anything. I was embarrassed. I mean, I thought, no, don't, you know. I didn't know how to react to that. And let me tell you, they took up a love offering, and it was quite a love offering, you know. Blew me away. But I remember coming home, and I was just praying as I was driving down the road. And I said, Lord, I don't know about this, you know, paying guys to come preach. I don't know about that stuff. I don't really like it. And I remember I prayed. I said, Lord, I don't care the size of the church. I don't care if I said, I'll never charge anybody.
Right.
This love offering, I'm not so sure about it, but if they want to do that, okay, you know. But I said, I'll never charge a dime to go preach, you know. I said, and I don't care the size of the church, you know.
Yeah.
I'll go wherever you send me, because I think what it was, that same weekend I was there, used to be a guy in Arkansas that was a weatherman or something, and he was a Christian, and he quit that to go into evangelism. And I heard he was there that weekend or the one before, but I also heard he charged like $5,000 to come, and it was a big church there in town in DeWitt.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, what? I mean, I'm thinking you charge somebody to come. You know, I'd never heard of this stuff.
Yeah.
And I just remember thinking, I don't even want that thought in my head. Yeah. And I just thought, I'll never charge anybody nothing, you know.
Yeah.
I thought, I don't even think it works that way.
Well, you know, the Bible's pretty clear. You're not supposed to muzzle the ox that treads the corn.
Yeah.
They quote that in the New Testament as New Testament elders, and I'm not trying to criticize you, but I know people that don't think you should pay the pastor. They're like, hey, he ain't entitled to nothing. I'm like, well, the Bible disagrees, and it's very clear.
Yeah, because I'm a full-time pastor now, you know.
Yeah.
So.
And the love offering thing is, you know, here at the bookstore, people want to pay for their book. You know, they're like, well, I've got plenty of money. I'll just pay for my book. I'm like, no, you won't. We give stuff away. We don't sell it. And they're like, well, I'll just, where's your tip jar? All you ministries have your little tip jar. I said, you look for it. When you find it, you fill it up. And they'll look all around in here, and they go, well, where do you give your, I mean, if you're a ministry, every ministry is like after money. I'm like, not this one. And they're walking around looking, and I'm like, we don't take money. And it just puzzles them.
Yeah.
But that's the way I want it to be. If I took tips and they could pay for their books, and they could, you know, we'd take, oh, yeah, hey, thanks, you know. So we're giving them a $10 book, and they're giving us a $20 bill. Then they're walking out of here going, well, they didn't give me nothing. You know, I paid for it.
Oh, yeah.
And so occasionally people come in here, and we just tell them no, and then they just throw a $20 bill on the bookshelf and run out, you know. Or stick a $100 bill on my desk and leave. But we're pretty adamant about not wanting any books or wanting any money. And the reason we do that is because we want to be free with what we've given, you know.
Right.
I had a lady in here this morning before you got here. I wasn't going to open up today. I was just carrying in a book order and setting it down on the counter. And this lady said, are you open? I said, well, you're welcome to come in and look around. And so I was carrying stuff in and out. And I walk in. I was like, have you been here before? And she's like, no, I'm from Little Rock. I said, you live around here? She said, no, I'm from Little Rock. I'm a lawyer. I'm here to have a court case today. I said, oh, okay. She said, I'm just killing some time. I said, well, all the books are free. She snapped her head around. She goes, what? And I said, well, they're all free. We limit you to one. She goes, how do you make any money? So we don't. well, who pays for all this? How do you do this? I said, the Lord's been good to us. We want to be good to you. I like your concept, but I don't think you're going to last very long. And every time they say that, and I've heard that, 100 times, I just don't know how long you're going to be able to stay in business. You're going to give away all these books. I'm like, lady, I've filled these shelves 5 or 6 times. We've given nearly 900 people books in the last 7 months.
Hey, that's awesome.
So, and then some of them take a Bible too. Some of them also take gospel tracts and pamphlets and booklets. And so, yeah. But look, if the Lord's in it, then over time, here's what we can say. How's that crazy guy down there still giving away books and won't take any money?
Right.
And I do take money. I have a lot of churches that support me. I get invited to preach places where they give me offerings that are way more than anything I've delivered, just like your church did when I preached at Bowlegs. Y'all took up an offering and sent me home with a substantial amount of money, and that covers my expenses, and it covers this building and all these books. And ever since we've begun it, we've lacked nothing. The Lord just keeps providing. And
it's almost like God is all powerful and sovereign and
has the cattle on 1,000 hills.
Yeah.
Are you getting sore, Ronnie? Are you need to stand up and stretch?
No, I'm good, man.
You're good? All right.
Yeah.
No, I just think about George Mueller and his orphanage. He's like, I want to do this, and I don't want to ask for money, and I don't want to be going around begging for, all the projects I have. I just want to pray about it, and I want to be faithful with what I got. And that's kind of the same mindset I have. It's like, I just want to be faithful with what I got. And if I get more than I need to live on, I want to give it away. And Tom Gillum. You met Tom Gillum?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You
saw him at Jubilee last year. I've known him for a while. I was telling Tom Gillum kind of some of the things I wanted to do when I first stepped down as pastor and started doing mission work. And he said, Brother Harold, if you want to be a reservoir, God will fill you up to the rim. He said, if you want to be a channel, God will just keep pouring through you. He'll just keep pouring and pouring, because what he's pouring in you, you're pouring out. He said, if you want to be a channel, God will just keep pouring. And I thought, man.
I like the way that guy puts things.
Yeah, I thought, man, that's right. That's what a lot of missionaries are like, and they're not wrong. They're saying, hey, I need $4,000 a month to live on. Right now I have $3,500 coming in, so I'm 89% supported. You know what I mean? And I need this much more to be fully supported. So when I started doing this, they were like, so how far along are you in your support? I'm like, I don't know. I'm just working. And they were like, well, how much do you have pledged to come in each month? I'm like, I don't know. Not enough to live on. Well, what are you living on? I said, well, I'm also interim pastor here. They're giving me a little bit to shepherd them. I'm over here, this guy's giving me a little bit. And it just kind of moves around. They're like, yeah, that don't add up to enough to live on. I'm like, yeah, I know, but it's working. And when Tom told me about being a channel and as to a reservoir,
right?
There's a lot of guys that are reservoirs. This is what I need to function, and the Lord's providing everything they need to function. But what if you want to give away? What if you want to support a pastor? What if you want to support a church that's in trouble? What if you want to give? What if you're a missionary and you want to give to other missionaries? And would God continue to give you money if you were going to do that with it? Or was he going to say, hey, man, I gave you enough to live on, and you turn around and gave it to somebody else, that's on you.
Right.
And so I'm just of the opinion that this is the way it should be.
Yeah. You
can be one guy fully funded, or you can be a guy trying to do a whole bunch of other stuff, and let's just see what God's willing to fund.
Yeah, I remember reading years ago about Spurgeon. Probably more people know about it now, but I read where I think he gave away about 90% of what he took in.
Yeah.
It was crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah,
in today's money, it was like tens of millions of dollars that he gave away.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just think that's a healthier. I mean, look at New Testament missions. It looks nothing like what New Testament missions look like today.
Yeah.
And, a lot of people, they wrestle with what I do. They're like, well, how do you call yourself a missionary? You ain't going overseas. You ain't planting churches. I'm like, well, if you are already overseas, do you have to go overseas? And they were like, well, I don't understand what you mean. I'm like, Paul didn't go overseas. He just went around the corner of the sea, of the Mediterranean Sea. And they're like, oh, okay. And I'm like, so since Paul didn't come to America, he's not a missionary? Well, Paul planted churches. I was like, oh, okay. Well, what about Titus? What about Timothy? What about Apollos? Well, they planted churches. Yeah, they also are sitting back at Corinth, sitting back at Ephesus. Mm-hmm. They're also going back to these churches. Who's doing that?
Right.
We've boiled missions down to this. If you're not planting a church or you're not going to some lost tribe in the Andes Mountains, you're not a missionary.
Right.
And,
yeah, I remember, I think it was when we were praying about possibly going to Ireland. I was looking at just the word missionary, and I don't remember where I looked this up at, but it basically said, it could go out into an unreached area or a place that had once been reached and for whatever reason it pretty much died out. You know? Churches are down to nothing. And
right.
And that's just a part of things that there's not a lot going on. And the problem is most people today are looking at that and going, I don't want to deal with that.
Yeah.
There's no glamour there,
Right.
That's where I'm really thankful for guys like Josh Staggs and Michael Sanchez and just different friends that, I've met through you that were willing to go to these places where there were 7 or 8 people, 10, 12 people.
Yeah.
And, it always blows me away when you hear about places like that and you can't hardly, it's like pulling teeth to try to get some guy coming out of seminary to go do it.
Yeah.
And it's like, what do you think you signed up for?
And here's the thing. At one time, we had 3 or 4 guys floating around here with nowhere to preach. God called me to preach, and so they're filling in, and Josh came to me, and he's like, well, I said, are you preaching a lot? And he's like, not really. But only 2 or 3 churches really knew who he was. So I sat down and found a list of churches without pastors, and I found like 40 of them within an hour's drive of where he lived. Yeah. Maybe it wasn't 40. Maybe it was 20. I don't know. It's a bunch.
Quite a bit.
It's a bunch. I wrote a little letter recommending him with his information and my information, and I mailed it to every one of those churches. And all of a sudden, people was calling Josh up wanting him to fill in. I'm sorry, I'm already booked. Sorry, I'm already preaching somewhere else. Where are you preaching at? I'm preaching at Waldron. I'm preaching in Springdale. I'm preaching Siloam Springs. I'm preaching over here at Booneville, and so Jared Links was the same way. Jared, was called to preach and didn't really have anywhere to go. Unless somebody got sick, he didn't have anywhere to preach. So we started mailing out these letters, and people started calling him or calling me and asking about him. And those guys all end up pastoring now. We don't have any more preachers.
Wow.
Gary Fitzpatrick was unemployed.
Yeah, Gary, another one.
He was one that was free for a while. Now he's pastoring at Roland. And so now when someone gets sick, like I got a phone call the other day, said, hey, I'm sick. You're the only guy that ain't pastoring anywhere. And I'm like, well, I'm already preaching out of town. I can't just cancel. So we really need more preachers. Wherever I go next as an interim to help them get back on track, when it comes time to look for a pastor, I don't want an existing pastor to have to quit a church and go somewhere. I'd like to see a pastor raised up to take that place.
Right.
And it's easier to take a guy like Jared Links or Josh Staggs, who are local guys that are preaching here and pastoring here, to say, hey, here's a church of 25 people. Here's a church of 10 people. And they take off there. They go preach there some. They learn to love the people. They see the potential. They see that this is a place they can go work and take off, as it is to say, Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Do you have anybody that's $350,000 in student loan debt that would come pastor a church of 12 in the Ozarks?
Yeah.
Not happening.
Yeah. Yeah, you're exactly right, man. And yeah, I mean, I totally agree with that.
So I want to start teaching some classes after the first of the year. I've had too much going on to do it now, but I want to teach some preaching classes after the first of the year.
Oh yeah,
and I want to do it here at the bookstore in the evenings, probably a Monday, Tuesday, or Thursday, one of those evenings. And I'm not looking for this to be a big class, but I would like to have 2 or 3 guys come and be able to come and just let me go over some fundamentals of preaching. Preaching's not something I think you can teach.
I agree with you.
It's something you either have or you don't.
Yeah. Now there's things you can learn and glean and things like that, but as far as just preaching,
Well, when I surrendered to preach, the pastor that we told, the interim pastor, I told him my whole spiel, and he didn't say, "Amen, praise God." He just turned his back to me and started digging around in his desk drawer and pulled out a book and started writing. And he wrote for 10 minutes. And I'm sitting there in silence, looking over at my buddy that that spilled the beans about what I was doing. I'm looking over, I was like, "Thanks a lot, you loser." I'm looking at him, I'm like, "What? Now what's he doing?" He turns around, he goes, "Well, I was determined to convince you wasn't called to preach, but after what you've heard, I'm not going to say anything. But you're going to need this book." And it was a book by, I think it was Bryson, like Harold Bryson. It was how to build sermons, how to construct sermons, or something like that. So he said, "You better study this thing up." So I got it, and Ronnie, it had hermeneutics. It had exegesis. It had all these words I'd never heard of.
Yeah.
So I'm constantly having to go to the dictionary and remind myself of what that word means. It's talking about a diagram of a text, and it's teaching you how to preach expositionally.
Yeah.
But it's over my head. I pretty much do what's in the book. But the book didn't help me because it was for people that were in their third year of higher education.
Yeah.
And so I don't think what they were doing was necessarily hard. Here's who he's talking to. Here's what he said. Here's the context that's in. Here's what it applies today. But what I see missing in young preachers today, and I don't have any young preacher in mind, but what I'm hearing, if I go to a conference and I hear some young preacher get up, is I'm hearing a cookie cutter diagram sermon that sounds just like every other preacher in the conference. There's no individuality. So what I want to teach in these preaching classes is I want to teach people how to illustrate a text. Now, what story in your life can you take that truth and apply it to? What story in your life can you take and tell that illustrates that truth?
Right.
And that's where the preaching, you read the commentary, you know what the text says, you know what the commentators say about it. Just push away from your books and say, now how can I get this on a farmer's level?
Exactly.
How can I teach this to a dump truck driver? How does a mechanic? Not only can I teach it to him, why does a mechanic need to know it? Yeah. Why does it matter to him? Why does a plumber need to know this? And that's what's missing in today's.
Yeah. The thing of it is, for me, when I read a book like you're talking about, they start pulling it apart and breaking it down. And even though, like you said, I may be doing what they're saying, when I do that, it just messes me up.
Yeah.
And it's like I used to tell people this. I said, there's people that are practice people. Like you take a basketball or something. I had these 2 guys on our team. Both of their last name was Cottrell. They weren't related. They were both 6'7". The younger one in practice would just school the older guy. He was my age, the older one. But when it came time for game time, oh man, that guy that was elder, man, he was a gamer. You could give me that stuff, and I couldn't do it. If I was in a classroom, I'd get an F. But this is where it comes back. Did God call you? Did He give you a gift to preach?
Right.
And that's where it comes in. And I don't even want to say that and even sound arrogant in it. I just know what I know when God uses me.
I know what preaching is, and I know what it's not.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people are given a book report.
Right.
And everybody has to give a book report in school.
Yeah.
And I think what we're missing is preaching,
Yeah, people ask me, because I do joke a lot. I probably do make one of the worst outlines there is. I mean, it's
you make good outlines.
Well, it's what it is. It's like I know how my mind is. There's going to be things that I know are going to hit my mind that I'm not thinking of yet, but it happens every time, and there's no possible way I can put that in notes.
Yeah.
So I pretty much just use bullet points.
Yeah.
I mean, and every now and then I might have a quote that that I want to say.
But here's the key, though, Ronnie. You're familiar and comfortable with the text.
Yes.
You're not just walking up there, picking a text out, and then taking off. You've read that text. You've studied that text. You've thought about it all week. Your notes are just a reminder of what you've already put in your head.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's usually the advice. There's a young guy I know that as far as like intelligence and stuff, he's so far beyond me. It's unreal. And I mean, he knows the stuff. And I did give him a challenge about a year ago. I said, I want you to study everything out. Write it out. Because he writes a manuscript, and to preach from. And I said, do all of that. And I said, then when you go to the pulpit, leave all of that in your seat. And you just saw the panic on his eyes.
Oh, yeah.
Because the truth is, the guy gives so much information, and he talks fast. I told him, I said, brother, you're going so fast. I said, there's not even a speed bump for somebody to say amen. We were gigging him pretty good. But, I mean, but now if you know the word and you're listening, man, you're like, gosh, I've heard him go on for 30 minutes and go, well, that's my introduction. Oh my Lord, that's the whole sermon, brother. But but you
go ahead.
But I told him, I said, go to the pulpit without the notes, and I said, you watch what God will do. I said, it's going to slow you down. You're going to focus on people, and you're going to bring out just what needs to be brought out.
Yeah, that's good.
But
I think one of the things that's also missing in preaching is making eye contact.
Yeah.
Looking the people in the eye, not just glossing over and burying back in your notes, or not just looking up in the corners of the room.
Yeah.
Look at the people. Do they look tired? If one or two of them look tired, maybe they're on blood thinners.
Yeah.
If they all look tired, maybe you preached too long. Maybe you lost them.
Yeah. I've asked those questions. I'm like, are we all here?
Yeah.
Everybody's flatlining on me.
Yeah, but that will make you a better preacher, because if you're sitting here and you're belaboring something they all already know, you're like, maybe I need to move to the next point. Maybe I'm saying too much here. And so if you will just, go through these points and look through and as you're preaching, you're looking around, if they're all like, amen, amen, and they're smiling and they're nodding their head, then, hey, we're all going in the same direction. Let's keep going.
Yep.
And I think that kind of interaction, like you and I sitting here, I'm like, do you need to stand up? Do you need to get up? Or you need to get out of here? Because we don't have no time limit, you know?
Right.
If I were preaching in a church, you might have one guy preach all day, you know?
Somebody else ain't thinking
And
that.
I'm like, yeah, everybody else has bad hips. They're saying no,
Right.
And so that's why I think it's important to know your audience, to look at your audience. And you're not impressing anybody. You come in and preach an hour. And some guys only have 30 minutes worth of material and they preach an hour. You would be better if you preached 30 minutes. If you just got up and gave all your good stuff in 30 minutes, instead of just giving us a bunch of extra Bible verses, you're not preaching. You're filling time.
Exactly. You know, I'm going through Romans right now. And every time I start, you know, I think I want to get from here to here. And then I get into that and I'm like, I am not making it that far. There's just way too much. And it's not like I'm probably I'm not like Martin Lloyd-Jones that, you know, could do 4 sermons on but God, you know.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
But I mean, he did like 238 sermons in Ephesians.
Wow.
6 chapters, you know. You're
Wow.
Like, gosh. But I mean, now, you know, I'm not going to argue with him too much, but I'm thinking that might be.
You want to say there's 65 other books. You're not going to run out of these, you know.
Yeah. But I was at a conference a while back, and some old boy was there, and he was a rough old guy in the past. He was I think the guy told me he used to be in the Hells Angels.
Wow.
So he was a big old rough dude. And we had ate lunch, and after lunch I was going to be preaching. I think I was preaching the last message on Saturday night. Anyway, he says, I just want to know one thing. He goes, are you going to look at people? Or are you going to look down at the pulpit? Because most everybody was preaching from manuscripts, and they're doing this number, and ever so often doing that.
They just kind of glance up and go back in their manuscript.
Yeah, and he said, you're just going to stare at your notes, and I said, well, you're in luck. I said, I don't really do notes, so I'll probably be looking at you, man.
I think that's what, you know, everybody takes the old Jonathan Edwards. Well, Jonathan Edwards brought about the Great Awakening. I'm like, dude, Whitefield did the lion's share of the work. Yeah. Edwards' sermon printed well and read well. Nobody was standing in the courthouse square, thousands of people to hear Jonathan Edwards preach.
Yeah.
Just because Edwards was boring and wrote a great sermon that circulated the colonies doesn't mean that people went to hear Edwards preach.
No.
If you want to see people excited, you need to be looking at them when you're standing before them.
Yeah. I remember early on preaching in, you know, in the first church I was in, and I was like you just described. I was here or I was looking over the top of everybody. And one day I think accidentally made eye contact with somebody on this side of the room. And then I found somebody over here, and everything began to change, you know.
Yeah.
But I, you know, and it's like nobody ever taught me that stuff. So everything I learned was just kind of the school of hard knocks, you know?
Yeah.
But
I think what I want to teach in this preaching class is I can't teach them how to preach. You know, they may never ever, you know, get it. But what I want to give them is just some pointers. Like, look, if God's called you, these are what I've learned in 20 years.
Yeah.
And I've hosted a lot of conferences, and I've preached with a lot of other people. I've heard a lot of different styles of preaching. And
go to the Jubilee, man.
Yeah, it's wonderful. But I can appreciate all the different styles. The only one I can't appreciate is the guy that's up there reading it with his head buried in it. And I'm like, okay, if, you know, why don't you just hand me your manuscript and I'll read it before I go to bed tonight? You know?
Yeah.
I want you to deliver that. God didn't call you to be a scribe. He called you to be a preacher, you know? But yeah, I mean, I had a guy almost kick me in the face one time in a sermon, at Jubilee.
He was preaching.
Yeah, he was preaching. Yeah, no,
Larry. Wasn't Larry?
No, but no,
wasn't Todd Bentley, was it?
No, he kicks old ladies. He don't kick other grown men.
With his biker boots.
Wow. Oh, man. Well, we've been going almost 2 hours, and one thing I've learned about this format, we're going to have to get better chairs. We're going to have to get some swivel chairs. We're going to go 2 hours. So,
well, it's been fun.
It has been fun, and I really, I'm glad you agreed to do it. And it's when we talked about recording the podcast on confrontation and conflict, I kind of knew. You know, I was like, yeah, that'd be good. And I thought, but what I would really like to do is capture some of just the conversations you and I have.
Yeah.
You know, anyways, or other pastors have. And so
yeah,
I think what I want to do in the future is just to sit down with people like this and just say, hey man, just pencil in 2.5 hours. We'll talk till we run out of stuff to talk about, or till our till our hips hurt or till we have to go to the bathroom or who knows what. Anyways, Ronnie, thanks for coming on.
Hey, I enjoyed it, man.
I did too.
Anytime.
Yeah. If you guys want to hear more of this, subscribe to the Backwoods Baptist podcast. And I can't guarantee you'll learn anything, but you may be entertained. We'll see you guys on the next one.